Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mockery Cushion. I'm Faye Lenner.
I'm Ben Maloney.
I'm Hugh McCarran.
And I'm Rick Benjamin over here on the other side of the ocean.
So today we are joined by a wonderful guest. We have US-based musical historian and conductor Rick Benjamin.
Hello, it's great to be here.
So Rick, could you please tell everyone a bit about what you do and why you have such a passion for it?
Sure. Well, I'm a full-time music historian and conductor. I'm probably best known for my work with a repertory ensemble called the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra. But basically for 35 years now, since my student days, I have had a mission to find lost American scores, music of all kinds, basically orchestral music though, crawling through attics and basements, looking for discoveries, old theaters and things, and bringing my findings to the orchestra to perform them and record them. And we've been on this sort of crazy quest now since 1986. I started the orchestra at the Juilliard School back during my undergraduate days. And we've been rolling all this time. We're on hiatus now, of course, as the rest of the performing arts world is due to COVID. But that's essentially the job. I do work for the orchestra. It is an actual institution. But essentially, I am freelance. I do conduct other orchestras as well. Over in your neck of the woods, the Irish National over in Dublin. I've come over there a few times, and orchestras in Scandinavia and all over the place. But Paragon's travels have taken me and the orchestra to 7 countries and 49 states. We've played in most of the major concert halls in North America now, and
Which one's
looking forward to
missing?
getting back to it.
Which state is missing?
We're missing Idaho, and I'm not sure what's going on out there or what happened. I think it was something I said on the Today Show once about Idaho, and I've been banned from the States somehow. But for some reason, we have never played in Idaho. We've been in Iceland, but we have never been in Idaho. So, I mean, think of the indignity there. I mean, there even are some good potato-based rags we could be playing, but they have none of it. So
There's a rag for everything.
there is, actually. In our collection of orchestrations, we have over 800 of them from the period, and really any subject you care to think of, it is covered in a syncopated fashion. So,
What's the strangest title of a rag that you've ever heard?
oh boy, the strangest one, something called Frangipani rag, I think, is the strangest one I can think of off of my top of my head, which I'm told is some sort of pastry, I think. But anyway, there's a microbe rag, there's an epidemic rag, there's an influenza blues from 1918. So essentially, if we could meet, we'd have a whole theme concert ready to go. But
We need a COVID rag.
yes,
Yeah.
well,
I'm on it.
composers are on your end of the line, so get cracking.
More than 55 for it this time.
Yeah. Ouch. And a lot of what you do is based in theatres, right? With playing to movies and playing.
Right, yeah. We do. We've played more than 700 programs accompanying films over all this time. In fact, unfortunately I seem to be dreaming in black and white now. It's really odd. But yeah, back in the latter part of the 1980s, because the instrumentation for the orchestra is the same both for music that was played in the theaters and ballrooms as was played in the early days of the cinema, we started being asked to accompany films as a kind of a sideline, and the presenter would have the film and they'd have the musical score, and we would show up and rehearse and play. But then in 1992, something amazing happened. I was sitting in my office and the phone rang, and it was the chief librarian of the music division of the Washington, D.C. Public Library And he said, Rick, we were down in the basement yesterday. I love calls like that. And he said, we found 26 crates of silent film orchestra music from the old Capitol Theater here in Washington. It's been sitting down there since 1942. No one's opened it. We're moving into a new building. We need someone to take it. Would you be interested? And of course, by that point, I was already standing at my desk with the phone, getting ready to head out there. And basically, the story was that whatever institution could promise to do public performances with the materials would get it. So they asked Eastman School, and they couldn't promise. They asked a few universities, they couldn't promise, but we could. So I indeed went down with a truck, great big, panel truck, and spent a day and a half loading that stuff. And it was the scores for over 900 silent films, going back to 1912. And so from 1992 forward, we have spent a lot of time accompanying films with their original scores. And there's a bit on YouTube of us. You can see us doing things. But it's really fascinating. It's actually that melding of sight and sound from that period is just magic that you can't describe. And it only seems to work in a large auditorium, too, especially a historic cinema, which is largely where we do these performances. You'll have 800 people. You're in the pit with the original score for Charlie Chaplin's whatever, and the audience is sitting there, and then the magic happens. So it is a lot of fun. It's the most difficult conducting that I've ever had to do, and I've done ballet and opera and everything, because live performers are somewhat pliable, even if you're not doing their tempo with the accompaniment. You won't hear about it until later. With a film that's going, say a 45-minute film, when you get out of sync, the audience knows when the sword fight is still going on and the love music is, right. So it's actually quite difficult to do, and somewhat stressful too. The guys in the pit say they never see me sweat as much as when I'm doing a feature film. Because
you don't have any kind of, I guess there was no click tracks or things back then. You're just going
no,
off.
we didn't do anything like that in those days. And from what I gathered from reading, there were a lot of journals or magazines devoted to this work back in the day, and I collect them and I read them. The kind of tightness of synchronization that we're used to as people who watch television and modern movies wasn't expected in the 1920s. They got pretty good. But that really, cutting off here and starting this and that is something that you can only do with a totally produced product on a soundstage. But I try and get as close as possible because audiences have that expectation that, the iris is closing, the music cadences stops, and, the next cue begins. But it's pretty difficult to do. I don't know if you guys have heard, we have a great recording called Pioneers of Movie Music. It's 80 minutes of music played by various composers of that period. And we used a bigger orchestra too, about a 20-piece orchestra for that. So anyway. Is that
with horns and things as well?
Yeah, because in the larger cinemas here, we had what was called the full orchestra, which doubled the strings, added double reeds, so one oboe, one bassoon, 2 French horns, second clarinet, and sometimes harp. And so there are quite a few film scores in that bigger setup. Yeah. And in some of the cities back in the day, in the 20s, had enormous orchestras. 55-piece orchestra in a big city was not unusual. The Roxy Theater in New York had a 110-piece orchestra in the pit, playing 3 times a day. If you can imagine that. It was the largest orchestra on the planet. It's bigger than the New York Philharmonic. You can imagine these guys down there sawing away for their cartoon and the Western and everything else.
Anything that was thrown at them.
Yeah, and it was a high watermark for employment too, because there were literally, the numbers I've come across, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 orchestras of the United States during the silent era, just playing for cinema. So it's an army of people doing that every day, and indeed that formed the core of the symphonic tradition in the U.S. in the post-silent era. Some of our great conductors and musicians, players came out of the silent film pits. I mean, Eugene Ormandy of the Philadelphia Orchestra was a fiddle player at the Capitol Theater in New York. That's how he started his music career. And there are lots of stories like that. So,
I was just thinking, would you mind just running us through the basic makeup of a standard, ragtime orchestra? I guess for people that are unfamiliar with the concept.
Yeah, well, we call it we call these ensembles ragtime orchestras, but back in the day, that term wasn't used at all. In fact, I've never seen it on a historic document or a score or a photograph or a description in a newspaper. The group would have been just called an orchestra in the U.S. anyway. In 1900, there were only 2 or 3 symphony orchestras in this whole country. So if you said orchestra, what you meant was small orchestra, meaning 10 or 12 players. And of those, there were lots. There were about 30, 35,000 venues that maintained what we would call a small orchestra. And the instrumentation was standardized way back in the 1860s. Publishers all latched onto the same thing, and music arrangers, but it's essentially the small setting would be a flute, doubling piccolo, clarinet, 2 cornets, slide trombone, percussion on 1 player, piano, and then strings, 1 on a part, first violin, second violin, viola, and cello. And literally there were tens of thousands of things published and arranged for that combination. It was called 11 in piano. And that was the basic makeup of, as I said, tens of thousands of American orchestras.
And of course, all the surviving orchestrations of Joplin, which is
right.
what we're about.
Joplin had an orchestra like that too, and actually a couple of different times during his rather sad life and career. But that was the basic setup, and because these orchestras were expected to cope with everything that came along, everything in the line of popular music. In the 1860s, they'd be playing mazurkas and playing quadrilles and things like that. In the 1870s, they would add the 3-step. In the 1890s, the 2-step, and so on and so forth. By the middle 1890s, when ragtime started to come along as a popular fad and a middle-class sensation, the orchestras had to cope with that too. And so the pieces were scored for that combination, or in many cases actually composed originally for that grouping of instruments, because it was just what you did. It's what was out there.
Could you tell us a bit more about your work with Scott Joplin's compositions?
Sure. Well, an amazing thing happened in my second year at Juilliard. I managed to find the music library of one of the first recording companies, the Victor Talking Machine Company. And all of their material, their orchestral arrangements for their sessions, were being sent to a landfill. And I managed to get this collection for basically the cost of moving it. Literally, they were throwing it out. And mixed in with all this material were quite a few Scott Joplin pieces. Some of them one-of-a-kind things. They existed in piano form, but not in orchestration. And that's how the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra got started. I brought this material back to school with me, and we started performing and reading through these huge stacks of music. But I had known about Joplin through, of course, being a pianist as a kid, going through the early part of the 1970s where everyone was playing that. But seeing his music from this larger perspective of an orchestra, a small orchestra, was something that was eye-opening to me and many people. And through the years, I became interested in all of his other works. It became quite clear that he was a classical composer who also wrote ragtime. I mean, that to me is a very good way of describing it.
He studied with a German piano teacher, right? In his
right.
Youth.
He had a very heavy grounding in classical music. He went to the George R. Smith College and studied, counterpoint and things like that. And we know some of the books he was reading, the theoretical books. And he was studying classical music in New York again when he arrived in 1907. He was taking lessons again. So, and we know from inventories of the Joplin materials that were still around even in the 1950s. There was a piano concerto, there was a symphony, there was some chamber music, and so on. So there was a lot of other material there that is now lost. So anyway, he spoke to me in a wider way than the people who just like to play the entertainer on the piano. I got to see other aspects of his artistry as a composer, and that led me to great dissatisfactions with the treatment of his opera, Treemonisha, which is a fragmentary work. All of it existed until 1962. If you've read my book on the opera, and I think you have the essay, one of the attorneys for one of the estates threw out all of the materials for the opera, orchestration, staging, choreography, all that kind of stuff.
Tell us a little bit about that experience when you bumped into him.
It was a wild thing. Paragon Orchestra and I were doing a concert. Speaking of live radio, it was in 1988, and it was a live radio program, 1 hour, on the New York Times radio station, which was WQXR. It was the classical music station in New York City. And they did some live shows. And this was a live broadcast from South Street Seaport, which is a giant outdoor museum with sailing ships and a pier that goes out into the water. So we were performing this concert both for about 8,000 people who were there and then live on the air, which was very neat. And we finished this. It was a hot July day, and I was backstage and just getting ready to take my suit off and get back into street clothes. And the stagehand came up to me and said, "Oh, there's someone here who wants to talk to you. And he looks like a lawyer." And of course, what's this about now? America being famous for its the litigious nature of everything. And this gentleman was ushered in to me. He asked me to not reveal his name because he didn't want to be forever known as the man who threw out all of Scott Joplin's music. But he was an African-American attorney who had worked for one of the many tangled estates that had the control of the Joplin materials back in the 60s. And this was before Joplin had really come to international recognition. And as this gentleman said to me, in 1962, nobody knew who Scott Joplin was. Yeah. But he did describe to me the boxes of things that he had put away as well as he could remember. This was 25 years after he had done this. But he did say that he didn't, because I was sort of probing him about, did you see, what kind of instrumental names did you see? And he could only remember simple things, violin, and he said he saw cornet, things like that. So, but that's the answer to what happened. It's been kind of a Bermuda Triangle Sasquatch mystery of American music as to what exactly happened to Scott Joplin's materials, because there was, by all descriptions, an entire cellar full of stuff up in his final house up in Harlem, and then there wasn't, and nobody knew what had happened. So now we know at least that that it is gone.
extracts you'll hear in this podcast are from the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra's recording of Rick's reconstruction of Treemonisha. There, we heard a clip from the end of the overture.
And this wasn't, Treemonisha wasn't Joplin's first venture into opera, or at least musical.
That's right. Yeah, he had at least two other larger scale works. There was a ballet, which came out right around 1900 or 1902, called The Ragtime Dance. And that was something that he had actually staged in Missouri.
And we have the
and then
piano
there
version of that.
was a first opera called A Guest of Honor, which Joplin and his own company actually did tour. In fact, I found going through tens of thousands of old newspapers on microfilm, which is why my eyesight is so bad. Hello. That the opera had actually been performed in quite a few other places than had been originally supposed. He'd actually toured it for several weeks before disaster struck. One of the box office agents ran off with the proceeds, and which I should mention was a common hazard of the early show business. You had to really have a dependable person.
Eloping with the profits, yeah.
Yeah. So
did he perform it for the president one time or something?
Well, there's the theory, and my friend Dr. Edward A. Berlin has this theory that the opera Guest of Honor was written to commemorate President Theodore Roosevelt's invitation to Booker T. Washington, the famous black civil rights activist, the invitation to dinner at the White House, and that was in 1902. And so there's some theory that Ed has that's what the connection is, and it could be. I mean, he could explain it to you better.
Yeah.
Get him on the next show.
Yeah.
But apparently, yes, it is dedicated or based on an incident that occurred with Booker T. Washington.
Of course, the discovery about what happened to the original materials for Treemonisha then spurred you on to.
That certainly was, knowing that this stuff was gone, and of course, Joplin made this very weird, wonderful, posthumous pop stardom phase in the 1970s, early 70s, which was crazy. I mean, here's a guy who had been dead since 1917. He hadn't produced anything. And who was, frankly, not well known when he was alive. He wasn't a nationally famous person like Sousa or Victor Herbert. He was known in the cities where he worked and well regarded, but he wasn't a national figure at all. In fact, going through, again, tens of thousands of pages of contemporary magazines and newspapers, I've only seen him mentioned probably a dozen times in the media. And very small things, too, very, very little things. So you have to get into microfilm of historic black newspapers, the small newspapers in small towns, where you actually see what he was up to. And that's a fascinating subject. But in any event, I was too little to have seen some of the efforts to revive Treemonisha back in the 70s, because Joplin was a huge, hot commercial property. And everyone wanted to be playing his music. All the symphony orchestras here were coming up with arrangements of the Maple Leaf Rag and so on and so forth.
Is this all following Rifkin's early recordings?
Right, yeah. And I don't know what it was like in Great Britain, but here the ragtime revival was a real mania. I mean, The Entertainer was on a top 10 on AM radio, with current rock and roll things. I mean, it's really amazing. Wow. You would go to a shopping mall, and the Muzak system, the sound system, would be playing Scott Joplin music as you walked around to buy your whatever.
I would love that.
It was really crazy. If you look at old episodes of The Muppet Show, they work in all, they've got ragtime going on.
So we still get it in adverts all the time.
Yeah, TV adverts.
There's a cat food.
Yeah, it's in a cat food advert.
Yeah, right. Well, because it's good music too. It's good, and it moves people. So, but anyway, so this was a huge craze, and imagine the excitement of performing arts managers to discover that here we have not just these small pieces that are so delightful and people like so much, but oh my gosh, there's an extended work. There's an opera by Joplin, which at that time they thought hadn't been produced. It actually had been, but that's a story for another day. We have to get cracking here and get this thing on the stage because, I mean, this is huge. Well, Joplin is hot. This is, this is the beginning of classical crossover too, which is if you've been around arts management, that's a huge thing. Classical crossover.
Do you think people were kind of expecting a prequel to Gershwin or something?
Yeah. Well, exactly. Anyway, Joplin was hot. Here's a supposedly unproduced major work. Let's go for it. Well, there were problems. Nobody could find the orchestration. Nobody could find the stagings. Nobody could find this stuff. There was still at that point what we would call a Joplin estate, called the Stokes Trust, controlled all this stuff, and they decided that they would start commissioning people to make arrangements of this opera so they could produce it finally. And so the first attempt was with a fellow named T.J. Anderson, who's an academic composer. And he created kind of an interesting thing, and that's the supposed premiere of the work was given at Morehouse College in 1972, I think. People were excited about it because they'd never heard the music at all. But the estate was not satisfied with this arrangement for whatever reason. So then they commissioned William Bolcom, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning composer, to come up with another arrangement. Yeah, it was done, I think, just once at Wolf Trap, and there doesn't seem to have been any, recording made of it or anything like that. Right, and then we come to finally the estate commissioned Gunther Schuller to come up with an arrangement of this thing. It was really rather wild. I think he took something like 3 weeks to score this entire opera. I mean, it wasn't didn't spend a lot of time on it. No one was interested in the history or the origins or the purpose of this piece, or knew anything about African-American show business, which is where the piece was born, really. And Joplin was intimately involved in show business of Black America in the 19th century. They were just interested in getting something on the stage really quick so that they could sell some tickets, make a TV show, etc. So,
because that one has banjo and all sorts of stuff going on.
Yeah, it's really nuts. And so I had heard bits and pieces of it because they would play it on the radio. So the Schuller thing was premiered in Houston in 1975, and I was familiar with it just from hearing bits of it on classical radio, thinking, I'm not really going for this at all. And then eventually, quite a bit later, I might have been a student at Juilliard by then, but I don't exactly remember. That performance had been videotaped, and our public television station in New York played the whole program. And at that point, I knew the opera very well because I had acquired a copy of the piano vocal part, which was the only thing that actually survived from Joplin's time. And I was playing on the piano and singing, and imagining what it would be like in an old music hall with a pit orchestra and wooden scenery and canvas drops and simple, sweet production. And here comes this thing on my television. This really looked like Peter Max, if you remember, that sort of iridescent, weird paintings as a set, and guys in crocodile costumes crawling across the stage, and they had changed the reharmonized sections of the music. It's, wow, there's this giant blues chord in the overture that's not in the overture. It's suddenly like out of no place. It starts doing that. The instrumentation, of course, was strange. It was very big and heavy. There were horns. There was heavy brass. I think there were a couple of trombones and tuba. It just was a very strange and surrealistic thing to watch this. Like, what are these people trying to do? They're trying to add gravitas where none is needed. It's not that kind of a show. That's just not what it's about. And then a few years after this experience on television, I was asked to be a consultant in a production that was being done in New York with the Schuller score. And it was the same sort of thing. I'm watching this unfold going, why are you turning Scott Joplin, who has a very distinctive voice and something to say, and the only document coming out of the African-American post-Civil War period. It's the only opera about this. Why are you trying to turn this into Verdi anyway? And torturing everyone in the process. It doesn't make any sense. And no one, of course, in that production would listen to me anyway. So I determined at that point, this is about 1993, that I would go and create a forensic reconstruction, search the world for every single bit, molecule of information or score of this opera, and put together a forensic reconstruction. And I spent something like 15 years working on this thing. It was a long time. I actually went to Arkansas and met with the Joplin family. They're still down there in the Red River section of Arkansas and Texas. That's where the opera is set. The family is still there. And put this thing back together. And among the many things that Schuller had done was major alterations. He removed the dialect. If you look at the score, Joplin's score, he actually has all the characters singing in Arkansas dialect of 1880 for the Schuller production, and everyone who's used that material since then. That's completely gone. Everyone sings in standard English. It's very strange when you read Scott Joplin, who has left written, there's written prose. He wrote a manual of playing ragtime, and it's in this very standard, rather heavy English. It's very formal, very florid English. So he obviously didn't speak in Arkansasese or write that way. He was creating his opera to memorialize his people. This is what he was trying to do. So to actually just scrub that already takes one whole layer of meaning off of his work. So I put all of that back in, spent a long time working on this thing, and put various parts of the opera, the instrumental stuff, into Paragon concerts for a long time. And then finally, in 2003, we got the San Francisco Stern Grove Festival decided to produce it, an actual authentic circa 1911 performance of Treemonisha. And it went very well, and the rest is history. We continue to do, we've done about a dozen of them now in different places. And back in 2011, recorded the work with a major box set recording. So that probably used up every 1 and 0 in all of your computers. So we'll see you next time.
And for anyone interested, there's a book. Rick wrote a book as well about about all of this stuff, which comes with the recording, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, the book with the set. Yeah, you guys should have it. I mean, it's. I'm sure it's available there. The university must have it, or you could even buy it at some point. I don't know. So anyway, that's what we've been doing, and that particular work has been well received. The critical community, all the major critics lined up and said, "Wow, yeah, you're onto something here," and the academic people came aboard too. The musicologists at the big universities, by and large, have said, "Oh yeah, well, if you actually do it the way it says, it actually sounds right, and it works on the stage." So there you have it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. Whoever I've played this stuff to, they always say you'd almost never guess, but that combination, it just works so perfectly well. It's so it has a real, I guess, nostalgic sound of the period, doesn't it? Naturally.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sound that Joplin was used to hearing in terms of the instrumentation, the accompaniment too. I mean, when he went to the theater, that he was hearing small orchestras. It's debatable whether he ever actually went to the opera, because I don't mean his opera, but any opera, because there were only a few companies in the U.S. during his lifetime. And for example, he was living in New York the longest period, 1907 to 1917, and the Metropolitan Opera, really the only company, did not allow African Americans in the building. So whether he actually ever saw Lohengrin or La Traviata or anything is pretty debatable. But the sound he certainly had in his ears was the sound of the music hall of vaudeville and minstrelsy, because he actually did work in those worlds too. He was a theater musician. So it all makes sense that he was creating this opera not to try and bust down the doors at the Metropolitan, which he wasn't even allowed to come into anyway, but rather create a work to provide singing opportunities for African Americans who could not have an operatic career. There was just nothing they could sing. There was no repertoire at all and no place where they could sing it. But they could in a music hall. And so he decided to build this pocket opera that could be done in local music halls with a cast of about 20 people and an orchestra of 12. And it was a pretty good plan. It would have worked, I think.
There was a man before the war. Said he didn't like his mother-in-law. I know we'll have a jolly good time. Because the weather's very fine. Swing that lady, swing that lady, swing her gently. They go round, round, swing that chiffon, swing that chiffon, swing, swing, around, they go around, gals are smelling.
There, you just heard an extract of the chorus "We're Going Around" from Act 1.
So I remember there were rumours flying around when people first started looking at this thing that it was never produced, never performed, never
Right.
heard at the time. But that's not entirely true, right? Because I remember you saying you dug up some other contemporary reports that suggested.
Yeah, I did find that he had actually performed, if not the whole opera, some major excerpts of it at a small theater in New Jersey in 1913, summer of 1913, and there isn't any doubt about it. I mean, there are advertisements in the newspapers showing these performances were occurring, and then I found in the Showbiz magazine, which is called the New York Clipper, that he had indeed actually given these performances. This wasn't just an advertisement that no one showed up to. There were actual performances because it was logged into this newspaper that actually logged Metropolitan performances. So it did happen. Whether or not he liked what happened is, up to anyone's interpretation. I suspect that he didn't like the way it went, as many of us don't when we see our works on the stage. It's like, oh my God, I got to go back and rewrite this, or whatever. I need another soprano to sing the lead. And so it is true that he didn't talk about that performance or write about it anyway. We don't see anything in the newspapers, the black newspapers, of him saying, oh, we had this great show in Bayonne the other night.
You do see these odd things of people, dramatizing it as if he sort of took Treemonisha to the grave as a sort of dying, wish that it never quite went where he wanted. I mean,
right? Yeah,
that'd make a great film.
Well, that's you make a great point, Hugh. Someone actually needs to make a serious, at least a documentary about Scott Joplin. It hasn't been done.
Really?
There was a feature film about him in the early '70s called Scott Joplin, and it's terrible. I mean, it's really it's too big. Well, they had Billy D. Williams starring as Scott Joplin, and he was very good. And they had Art Carney of Honeymooners fame as John Stark, his publisher. But the entire, all of the facts of his life were completely changed and distorted, and as Hollywood does with pretty much any kind of topic, or in those days, anything to do with composers. If you watch any movie,
the Amadeus film of the ragtime world.
Probably even worse, because the movie Scott Joplin, they show him at his in his booth at the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904, and of course, he may have walked through the World's Fair, but we know what displays and exhibits were at the fair, and he was not there. They show him dressed regally in a $1,000 suit in his fancy house and all this kind of stuff. And I know from looking at the places where he lived that even throughout his life he lived in horrible places. Money was tight always, and the place where he lived the longest in New York on West 29th Street was essentially a slum. I mean, I looked up the building records of this building, the specifications in the Department of Buildings for this place. It's been torn down for years, but this is where Scott Joplin lived. It's where he wrote Treemonisha. It didn't have running water. 1910, 1911. You had to go outside to a pump in the back. And there was a privy back there, too. You can imagine that. So now the rest of New York had running water and electricity. And that was the other thing. The house didn't have electricity either. They lighted it with kerosene. So he was a man who really was not economically successful. And you see him going around even giving, he would travel around the city giving piano lessons, and he would accept used clothing as payment and things like that. So anyway, so when you watch the movie Scott Joplin, you see this rich guy, and he's world famous, and presidents and kings are slapping him on the back. You just, the question that has to come to mind is, well, what happened to him anyway? Why, what?
Yeah, it's such a shame that is such an inaccurate portrayal of his life.
Yeah, no, it's there's something actually mean about it too. I guess the producers didn't really anticipate that, but or that wasn't in their minds when they were doing it. But yeah, I mean, I think we're all going through life looking for truth, because that's the only way we can actually know where we are, where our consciousness is floating in the universe. Ooh, that's really deep. Mm-hmm. And the only way to know that is to know what's true and what isn't. So why not show this guy creating these beautiful compositions who was struggling? That's not only is it true, it's a better story.
That was an extract of the mini ballet Frolic of the Bears from Act 2. Now, as you know, Rick, we intended to put on this opera whilst at university. Asked everyone to play in the orchestra, they'd all agreed. We'd signed people up for auditions, bearing in mind the auditions were going to be done blind, so we wouldn't see who was auditioning. All of a sudden, it just got very out of control, and we heard from other people that the opera was cancelled. The society didn't even tell us.
Yeah, before it was discussed with us.
They didn't discuss it with us. It just got cancelled. And the chair of the society even quit over the choice of this production. And yeah, we got a lot of backlash for it. And a lot of people who didn't even know what the opera was about, or were basically having a go at us for trying to tell a story that we shouldn't have apparently been telling. And it just got very out of hand very quickly. And there were lots of accusations being thrown around.
You can almost hear the frustration in your voice.
It was frustrating because we'd spent so much time on it, and we'd been in touch with you, Rick, and you'd spent so long preparing the parts and everything. And then all of a sudden, it was just all cancelled. Yeah. Bearing in mind, they then didn't put on another show that year, so that's their loss. But honestly...
It's very puzzling. I mean, and without knowing, having a lot more information, it's hard to know what was going on there. But, this opera is, the themes are so uplifting and so universal. It's about education. It's about the uplift of helping people in your community. It's about a female who takes charge of a lost group of people and saves them. I mean, it's modern in every sense of the word, and why this should be controversial in any way is just absolutely puzzling. It is set in a plantation, or a former plantation in Arkansas, in the post-Civil War era. But I think as we are now in the 21st century, and everyone keeps telling me that we need to find a post-racial world, which I think is a good idea. Again, to not produce an opera by this downtrodden, immensely gifted black man seems to be a very, very strange and
and it almost seems like the same people who are constantly reinforcing the idea that these things need to be heard are sometimes the same people that shut them down over fear of how they're received.
So what would you like to sort of outline what we think, or what the motivations really were behind the people who didn't want this to go ahead?
It would be interesting, and if I can, I will comment on them. But I don't really know what was even said against the work.
Well,
Ben, do you want to explain that?
Well, I was just going to say the key word that you mentioned there, Rick, was that it was set on a former plantation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were maybe initially scared about the context, maybe even just through misunderstandings.
Yeah, and it's set after the date of emancipation as well.
Yeah, it's set in the 1980s.
Yeah, and I think people just, without knowing a lot about the topic, just jumped in and just voiced an opinion rather than learning all the facts and then voicing their opinion.
Yes. And that is one of the great problems of the world.
One of the other things with Treemonisha that I've encountered more recently as well is obviously it's kind of the only account in music anyway of someone who could relate to it.
Someone who actually lived through it.
Yeah, exactly. People have tried to do productions more recently where they've changed things about the plot or the music and so on, which in a way I find slightly more disrespectful to the message of the opera than just doing the original, doing it as a form.
Well, yes, as our stage director for my production, who is a wonderful African-American theater director from Minneapolis, said, his name is Richard Thompson, said, to change this negates Joplin the man. That's a direct quote, negates the man. Who are we to change it? I mean, I don't like Mona Lisa's smile, but if I show it with my paints and start touching it up, that makes me a complete idiot. And probably the rest. Well, in normal times, if I say I'm protesting, I could get away with it.
But these are stories and works of art, and it's almost like defacing them to disrespect what they meant to the composer.
Right. It's better to leave things alone, actually. I think, than to actually change them.
And people try to retrofit these pieces of art in order to fit their own narrative.
Contemporary fads or narratives, and again, we get away from the truth. What is the truth of this work? And again, for people who actually know the work, I mean, the themes you can't argue with unless you're a complete lunatic. I mean, who doesn't like education? Freedom. Who doesn't like, it's hard to argue with it. But again, it's presenting this to people who are not initiated, and that is a hard thing to do. So I salute you for making the effort to do it. And, on behalf of Scott Joplin, whose family I know well, we salute you.
Was a section of the chorus Aunt Dinah. What's different, Rick, about putting on an opera like Treemonisha?
An opera production company, a regularly established one, they have their templates and their working methods, and whether they're doing a German opera or a French opera or Italian, whatever, there is a certain production pattern that they use. You can't do that with Treemonisha. It's truly a one of a kind. Now, back in its time, in the early 20th century, there were other somewhat similar works in the African American theater. I mean, there was another opera composer working who Joplin was talking to, black guy in Harlem who was having works produced. And there were musical comedies, black produced and cast things on the boards that were running. So there really was an active world of black theater going on, and that's where this piece comes out of. But those conditions don't exist in your modern opera house, and they want to put their own gloss on it. And once that happens, you lose the work. The work becomes swallowed in the production value, and it's really about choral singing. That's what this piece is about. Choral singing and community, and Treemonisha singing in standard English, but no one else. That's the other thing. If you've looked at the score, Treemonisha and her student Remus sing in standard English, very refined, fine English, and everyone else, because they are in ignorance, are singing in dialect, and that's a device. So you take that away,
And of course, even use of, I guess you could almost call it leitmotifs as well.
Yeah.
Or certainly in the case of representing the community and the educated as a separate. I mean, he even uses, I guess, different musical styles to represent that in a way as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could spend, and I have done it, years literally going through this, working on it, and talking. Going, as I did, go to Arkansas and talk to folklorists down there who explain the origins of goofer dust and all these folk things that pop out of here. Now, Joplin and his black audiences in 1910, 1911, they would understand these references. The city audiences of African Americans in Chicago or New York had come from the Deep South recently. The Great Migration took place in the 1870s and was at its height about 1910, with black folks leaving Alabama and Mississippi and going to the city. And they would have, that was the audience. They would get this new experience of sung theater, no dialogue, but they would understand these references to these folksy things they knew about these jinxes and curses and not putting the hat on the bed because it's bad luck and all these sorts of things. And so there's a lot of context there.
Where their enlightened living came from, essentially.
Right. There's just so much context to it, but you have to know about it and you have to explain it to people and performers. I'll tell you, my first company in 2003, when we were going to perform this work, there was at the first or second rehearsals disgruntlement, and the chorus. There was a big problem, and I was brought in to speak with the chorus. They didn't want to sing the dialect. There's do's and dats and damn, no's, this kind of stuff. And I said, well, what's the problem anyway? And they said, well, we feel that this is demeaning to do this dialect. And I kind of scratched my head a little bit, and I said, well, how many of you folks have been in Porgy and Bess? Every single hand went up. Big smile. Yeah. Well, I said, you have been singing dialect written by those two great guys from the hood, George and Ira Gershwin. Do you know the Gershwin? Have another bagel and we'll write some dialect, and you can say dems and does and So they've been singing fake black dialect and been totally, totally happy with it.
Yeah.
And so here we have this dialect written by a man who spoke it, who lived there. This is an autobiographical opera. And suddenly heads are going up and down, and okay, I never thought of that.
And what do you think of? I know there are some theories floating about that maybe some of the characters related to people in Joplin's life, or certainly Treemonisha anyway.
Yeah, I mean it seems as though, and then again, this is something Dr. Berlin has posited, and I think he's right. It seems as though the character of Treemonisha is based on Joplin's wife,
his second wife,
Freddie. Yeah, because the dates all line up, and
she died quite young, right? Quite soon after their wedding.
They did. They had been married for only a matter of weeks. In fact, she died on their honeymoon trip. She caught some sort of fever and passed away. And so it is thought that the opera is a memorial to her, and that the character of Treemonisha is Freddie.
And he wrote a waltz for her as well, right? Was it
right? Yes, Bethina, which is a little bit of a mystery too. People wonder whether the photograph that's the cover art of the piano sheet for that is actually a photo of Freddie. There doesn't seem to be. Last I heard, and I spoke to Dr. Berlin probably 6 months ago, whose his new edition of The Life of Scott Joplin is now out in Oxford University Press, and he had found a photo of Freddie's family from the period that's very interesting. But so far as I know, no one has seen a picture of her. Some people think that photo on the cover of Athena is her, but I'm not sure about that.
And that was a slightly recluse period for him, was it? That he
apparently so. He's not. You don't find him in the checking in with the black newspapers and telling them what he's doing. And, it seemed to be as one would expect, a quiet time. He did apparently go up to Chicago not long after that, in 1906, to find out what was going on at the Pekin Theater, which was the country's really first black-owned, managed, and staffed music hall. And it was in Chicago, called the Pekin. And they had a wonderful fellow there named Joe Jordan, who became one of the country's first black millionaires through songwriting royalties. He was the music director there, and every 2 weeks he wrote a musical comedy from the ground up, all the songs, rehearsed it, and performed it at the Pekin. And Joplin went and stayed for a while to see what was going on with the scene there. And incidentally, the Paragon Orchestra and I have recorded an entire album of the music of Jordan and the Pekin Theater. So some interesting stuff to ponder there too, if you ever want to hear what was happening in that exciting spot. That's the wonderful thing about music. There's so many vistas to explore. It never gets tiring, and there's always something new to hear and new. Every day is something new and wonderful. Oh.
That was a lovely message.
Oh, that's a great way to end.
What a great closer.
Yeah. And what a wild way to end any piece, right? An extended stage work with something slow and poignant. And
I always think Treemonisha shows a bit of a different side in that last one, doesn't she?
Yeah.
She lets down her hair a little bit.
Well, the thing of it is, it's interesting, and I don't even know if I got into the book, that that is a traditional African healing dance. After a war, after a battle, the village would have this dance, this slow, sensuous dance with everyone touching. And that's where that comes from. I mean, it's out of ancient Africa, transported to 19th century Arkansas. So if you hear us do it, we're playing it slowly and sensuously. When you hear Schuller do it, it's like, it's like, no, please. This is a slow dance. It's even called a slow dance in the title.
Can I ask you? Is there a romantic subplot there, or with her and Remus?
Treemonisha and Remus?
Is that not to be revealed?
Speculated on. It is. I think it almost happened in my company once, but whether it's into the opera, we can't tell their spouses about that, though. That's another story. There could be, actually. There could be.
I guess it's, it's like that. It's like the classic film thing. It's almost left unsaid, isn't it?
Yeah. That
doesn't need to be said.
Yeah, in different performers, we've had a couple of different remises, and the degree of closeness of those two performers has varied too, depending on who's doing it. We started out, Indira Mahajan was singing Treemonisha for us, and then Anita Johnson later. So again, it gets in the chemistry of performers too. But you could be onto something there, Ben.
Well, we'll look into it.
If you'd like to find out more about what Rick does, you can follow the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra on Facebook.
Or subscribe to them on YouTube.
Thanks for listening, guys. It's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
And it's cheerio from me.
Teaches children, I don't actually like talking that much. It just makes me stressed. Okay. Oh God.
You can put the mask on if that helps.